Some murders make headlines, and others leave scars. Well, Jason McCullough's death did both, though solving it seemed to fall off everyone's to-do list. Shot dead on an eerily lit street in 1999, the 19-year-old's murder quickly became a cold case cliché, brief outrage, a bit of false hope, and a never-ending shrug from authorities. No suspects, no motive, and worst of all, absolutely no closure. Let's get into the details of how one young life ended and a whole community collectively agreed. We'll get to it later, after which they never really did. On a mildly humid night of August 28, 1999, Dartmouth, Nova Scotia was surely the last place anyone would peg for a senseless point-blank murder to happen. Sure, it wasn't heaven or anything, but it wasn't a dystopian battleground either. 19-year-old Jason McCullough, who is the subject of our discussion today, had just left a party on Joseph Young Street. It was just over a kilometer to his home on Russell Street. He was taking a casual stroll through Highfield Park, a well-trod path. A familiar path. Pretty safe, too, or so he thought. Before you know it, by 1:30 a.m., Jason was dead. A gunshot tore through the dead of the night, cutting his life short. Before he could even begin his 20s. Witnesses believed to have heard footsteps scattering after the shot because, self-preservation beats heroism any day. Residents rushed to call the police, but it wasn't until an hour later that Jason's body was found lying on the pathway between 100 and 104 Pinecrest Drive. 6 blocks. That's all he had left to walk. 6 blocks to the safety of his home. But he was 6 blocks too late. To understand the immense tragedy of this young boy's death, you first need to know the kind of person he was. Spoiler alert. You'll be heartbroken to find out he was the kind of guy who restored your faith in humanity. Yes, we lost another good one, guys. Jason wasn't just your average nice kid. Forget that. He was the poster child for decency. He was the kind of lovely boy who would shovel snow for elderly neighbors and help with their groceries, and he even earned the moniker Piglet among his friends for reasons that will remain endearingly mysterious. He wasn't just liked. He was adored by friends and family. If you're as touched by stories of incredible people like Jason, don't forget to like and subscribe, as Jason had a smile that could light up a room and a heart that was always ready to lend a helping hand. His loss has left a void that can never be filled, a testament to the incredible person he was. He was also a little bit of an achiever who could have definitely had a successful life ahead. Jason was the chief scout for Scouts Canada, a volunteer at the Boys and Girls Club, and a recent Dartmouth High graduate with acceptance letters from Dalhousie and St. Mary's Universities in his pocket. His future was as bright as his lovely smile until someone decided to cut it short before he even began living. Vanessa Clark, Jason's cousin, remembers him as the guy who would give you the shirt off his back. Literally, he was the sweetest guy you could have met, she said, something that was agreed upon by everyone who knew him. He was the guy who made you believe the world wasn't such a bad place. Ironically, that belief was about to be shattered in the cruelest way possible. Jason's murder was as random as it was horrifying. No boy as sweet and innocent as him would be involved in any sort of criminal activity. His record was clean as clean could be, and there were no shady dealings, no bitter vendettas or anything of that sort. He wasn't robbed, harassed, or even yelled at for any reason at all. Whoever killed him did not even rob anything from him, and they couldn't even rob his dignity even if they tried. This wasn't a crime of passion or greed. It was the kind of crime that made you question humanity. Police then assumed that it could have been a case of mistaken identity, a thoughtless and insensitive act of violence, they said. Poor Jason was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's right, folks. A shortcut through a playground, something he had done countless times, turned out to be his last and fatal mistake. The morning after Jason's murder, his cousin Vanessa woke up to a nightmare. "I'll never forget that morning ever," said Vanessa, recounting the moment her parents broke the news. Her dad, who never skipped work, was home, very evidently having a hard time handling the grief. Something was wrong. "They told me, go do your paper route. Come right home. We have to talk to you," Vanessa recalls. Very obediently, she delivered 32 newspapers, only to return and hear the heartbreaking news about how her dear cousin Jason was no more. That was just the beginning of the horrifying incidents that followed after. The next day, Jason's parents made an emotional plea at a press conference, describing their son as shy, kind, and giving. "We had 19 good years with this kid," his mother Carolyn said. "I only wish we could have more." A heartbreaking statement a mother would never wish to make about her child. Vanessa wasn't just grieving. Oh no, it was way worse. She was delivering newspapers with her aunt's tear-streaked face plastered across the front page for weeks. Now that's something awful to go through. Grief and public spectacle rolled into one cruel package. The murder of Jason McCullough quickly became one of Canada's most frustrating cold cases. And that too, after tirelessly working in the case to find out the actual truth. Despite their best efforts, police had no leads, no motive, and no suspects. It was as if Jason's killer had evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but heartbreak and so many unanswered questions. The community wasn't of much help either. A so-called code of silence blanketed the streets, fueled by decades of mistrust between locals and law enforcement. Because who knows who it could have been, who ended that poor boy's life. Witnesses who might have seen something chose to look the other way, either out of fear or apathy. Can't blame them for running from a gunshot either now, can you? To make matters worse, the area, though usually pretty uneventful, was still not the safest neighborhood in town. Sure, it wasn't a war zone, but it wasn't Mayberry either. Highfield Park, where Jason was murdered, was a pretty densely populated residential area with its fair share of problems. Yet Jason, ever the optimist, too innocent to realize what he was getting into, had walked that path countless times, trusting that his community had his back. Sorry that we had to break it to Jason in that way. It didn't. The murder of this 19-year-old didn't just rob a family of their son and brother. It surely must have shattered the sense of safety in that tight-knit community. What followed his tragic death was nothing less than a whirlwind of grief, confusion, and a police investigation that would frustrate even the most patient optimist. And it's evident that some of the grief still lingers among us. If you thought the worst had already passed, the aftermath has not even begun yet. Vanessa Clark remembers August 28, 1999, with such vivid clarity, it is almost as if it's her curse. She was just a child, barely understanding the weight of loss, yet the shock of losing her beloved cousin Jason hit like nothing less than a freight train. Returning home after a sleepover, she sensed the heavy silence in the house, which has always been an unspoken omen of tragedy. Her parents could do nothing more than what they asked her to do, send her off on her paper route with the cryptic instruction to return immediately afterward. One can only imagine how much the revelation didn't just break Vanessa's heart. It must have completely shattered her innocence. Her world, once filled with childhood games and carefree afternoons, was now plagued by front-page headlines featuring the grim stories of her beloved cousin Jason's death. For weeks, every newspaper she delivered bore his name, his story, and the grief of a family ripped apart by senseless violence. The McCullough family wasn't alone in their sorrow. The entire Dartmouth community mourned the loss of Jason. As we mentioned before, he was always known as a bright, compassionate soul who had touched countless lives without even knowing how much good he was doing for them. His parents, Carolyn and Alan McCullough, made an emotional plea for answers just a day after his murder. They begged to know why their poor child had to go through what he went through. In their pain, they painted a picture of a shy yet selfless boy, a kid who never stirred trouble but was always there to help others. The murder sure turned into a defining moment in Vanessa's life, casting a dark cloud over her teenage years. For her family, Jason's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would then be stretched endlessly for years together, filled with unanswered questions and an unbearable silence from the community. From the get-go, Jason's murder was a nightmare to investigate. He was so young with absolutely no criminal ties, no enemies, and no apparent reason for anyone to harm him. Meaning, no motive behind the crime. He hadn't been robbed. His murder bore none of the hallmarks of personal vendetta or premeditation or anything of that sort. Instead, it only portrayed signs of random murder, something the young boy truly did not deserve. Halifax Regional Police quickly took charge of the case without wasting any time, canvassing the Highfield Park area where Jason was killed. Despite how close the place of murder was to residential buildings, basketball courts, and a well-trodden path, there was a conspicuous lack of witnesses. They couldn't find many people to testify on his behalf at all. Sure, there were a bunch of people who had heard the shot and the sound of footsteps fleeing the scene, But when it came to naming names, the community completely clammed up. A code of silence seemed to have been implemented, which we must say kind of reflects on the relationship between the police and the people they were supposed to protect. As we mentioned earlier, Dartmouth in the late 1990s wasn't exactly a utopia. For years, tension had simmered between residents and the police, which meant that there was a lot of mistrust that became glaringly evident during the investigation. Jason's aunt once remarked that this code of silence was what kept the case cold for so very long. People feared having to come forward, either fearing retribution or harboring skepticism about the police's ability to protect them. And frankly, can you blame them? It's not easy to break years of systemic distrust overnight now, is it? Despite all the obstacles the police faced, the investigation wasn't entirely devoid of progress. A few months after the incident of Jason's murder, police released composite sketches of 5 men seen near the scene of the crime. These individuals were then labeled as persons of interest, though it's worth noting that none of these men was ever formally charged. Adding to the intrigue, 3 of these men had been involved in a home invasion a couple of hours before Jason's murder. Suspicious much. Armed and dangerous, they had stormed a house nearby, demanding money, and while also trying to terrify the residents of that house. While they were arrested and convicted for that particular crime that they committed, their connection to Jason's murder remained totally unproven. There was nothing factual or evidential proving that they were behind the murder of Jason. And thus, the trail went cold again. Later, in 2005, investigators made an announcement that they had received new information. A woman, possibly present in Highfield Park on the night of Jason's murder, became the focus of their search. For a brief moment, it seemed like the case might finally gain traction. But then again, we know that it never did. The woman was never identified or located. Whether the lead was genuine or just another desperate grasp at straws, it did not last very long. It fizzled out before anyone could make anything out of it, leaving the McCullough family and the community no closer to answers. By 2014, the case had been investigated to an exhaustive degree where it couldn't be investigated anymore. Heck, Detective Tom Martin, who led the investigation until his retirement, described it as one of the most thorough probes he had ever undertaken. The police had conducted over 250 interviews, followed countless leads, and poured a whole lot of resources into solving Jason's murder. Yet, despite all their countless attempts, closure remained far from achievement. The case was compared to another infamous cold case, the case involving a girl just as old as Jason, the disappearance of Kimberly McAndrew, a 19-year-old who vanished in 1989. And you know what's so weird? Both cases shared many eerie similarities: young victims, no clear suspects, and a maddening lack of resolution. For Jason's parents, the lack of answers has been a source of relentless frustration for years together. They had spent 2 decades yearning for justice, pleading with the community to come forward with any information at all. Their heartbreak could be felt through their words, and their grief was etched into every plea for help. Even now, police insist they believe there were witnesses to Jason's murder. They hold on to the hope that maybe with time the fear would erode, and someone would be bold enough to finally speak out. But as years turn into decades, the possibility of a resolution grows slimmer and slimmer. In the years following Jason's death, the city of Dartmouth took various steps to honor his memory. The park where he was killed was renamed after him, and it was called the Jason McCullough Memorial Park, a bittersweet gesture for a life that deserved so much more. While the park now serves as a sign of remembrance of that lovely soul, it's also a painful reminder of the senseless violence that robbed Jason of his beautiful future. For Vanessa and her family, it's a place where grief and love coexist, a little space to remember Jason not as a victim, but as the kind, selfless young man he was and could have been. Sure, time does heal a lot of wounds, but whoever came up with that gem clearly wasn't trying to solve a 2-decade-old murder. As the years have stretched on, Jason McCullough's family, community, and a few very determined detectives have grappled with a chilling reality that closure is a luxury they may almost never get. The Jason McCullough case still remains a painful reminder of an unthinkable crime, an act that tore through the hearts of a family and left them grappling with the pain on their own. Let's address the elephant in the room, or more appropriately what we should call it, the gag order in the room. The so-called code of silence was just so unfortunate. Jason's murder happened in a crowded residential area. It's impossible for everyone to have missed it. Someone, or more likely several someones, definitely heard that gunshot. The suspects' faces were sketched and even printed for the world to see. And yet, nearly 25 years later, no one has stepped forward with the golden ticket of information, no matter what bait you tried to lure them with. Is it fear? Perhaps. Undoubtedly. But at its core, this silence also speaks to something deeper. A community so fractured by its relationship with authority that cooperating feels like a betrayal to their survival itself. Now, doesn't that just sound miserable? If the relationship with the community and the police would have been different, I think it would have been solved, Vanessa Clark once said. And she's right, don't you agree? After all, when the people you're supposed to call for help are viewed as the enemy, why risk stepping into the spotlight anyway? And this isn't just about one tragic night, or even just one victim. Jason's murder was a moment, but the aftermath has been a movement, or, more accurately, a glaring lack of one. The cold case task force once dedicated to solving crimes like his was disbanded, proving once again that bureaucracy and justice make for lousy dance partners. Even the $150,000 reward offered for information in Jason's case hasn't been enough to loosen any tongues. And let's be honest, if 6 figures can't make someone talk, then it's going to be a task to find out what will. It could also be because the promise of money is meaningless when weighed against the potential consequences of speaking out. Through it all, Jason's family had totally toughened themselves up because they still had to live on without any explanation as to who or why their young boy was taken away from them. Carolyn and Alan McCullough fought tirelessly for answers, even as years turned into decades. Carolyn's emotional pleas to the public have become an annual tradition that never seems to cease, which is indeed a heartbreaking reminder of the grief of a mother that never fades. Vanessa Clark, Jason's cousin, has also carried the torch. From organizing the annual Walk Against Violence to ensuring Jason's memory remains alive through events and advocacy, she has truly become the case's unofficial spokesperson through her actions. Her piglet stuffed toy, a nod to Jason's nickname, has weathered countless marches and rallies to show that they still mourned and they're still determined to find the truth. But then again, guys, grief isn't a monolith. While the family's public efforts are admirable, there's a lot of underlying frustration that's impossible to ignore. For every heartfelt speech and community event, there's the unspoken question, is anyone even listening? The park's upkeep is a marked improvement from how much it used to be neglected before. Vandalism is very swiftly addressed, and the area now buzzes with the laughter of children, a far cry from the shadowy path it once was. Yet, even as the physical space has changed, the emotional weight doesn't just go away like that now, does it? Despite the lack of closure, Jason's legacy still lives on, and his photo still graces the halls of Dartmouth High School, where a scholarship in his name helps graduates chase their dream. The Boys and Girls Club of Greater Halifax, where Jason once volunteered, continue to honor him through their annual Walk Against Violence. And wouldn't his soul be absolutely gleaming to find out? It's a beautiful event that brings together families, police, and community members. Even in music, Jason's story has found a voice. The song Some of These Children, written by musician Jim Henman, was very much dedicated to the young man, which is another small but lovely way to keep his memory alive. We must say he truly was a wonderful soul, and even in death seems to inspire people. And yet, for all the tributes, memorials, and marches, the story of Jason McCullough remains a painfully unfinished story. The irony of this case can be cruel. A life so full of promise cut short in an act of violence that one cannot even comprehend. And a case that remains as cold as the Nova Scotia winters. Police still haven't given up and still release statements every August 28th, urging anyone with information to come forward. The years may have brought perspective, but not peace. Will Jason's killer ever be brought to justice? At this point, it feels like a question that you'll never find an answer to. But as Vanessa Clark has said, the family isn't giving up. It's just going to take the right person to step forward, she once remarked. And perhaps she's right. Gotta admire her determination there. Maybe one day, someone will break the silence. Maybe one day, the fragments of this shattered puzzle will come together. Until then, the memory of Jason McCullough, his kindness, his potential, and of course his tragically short life will have to remain on a pile of the many unresolved cold cases. And that's a wrap on the unsolved murder of Jason McCullough. If you found this story gripping, make sure to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more true crime mysteries. But if you thought Jason's story was compelling, wait until you hear about 6 brave heroes who lost their lives in an explosion that rocked the city. Was it an accident or something more sinister? Find out in our video.